Sarah lived in a quiet neighborhood, a place where the biggest excitement was the mail delivery or a dog barking in the distance. She enjoyed the peace and stillness of her simple life. Her small house was modest but warm, filled with books, plants, and the cozy scent of her favorite lavender candles. Sarah worked as a librarian in the nearby town and spent most evenings reading or tending to her garden. She preferred it that way, a peaceful life after years of chaos during her troubled marriage. Her neighbors barely knew her beyond polite waves. Sarah wasn't unfriendly, but she kept to herself. She was healing from her past, and isolation felt like safety. However, despite her quiet nature, she always noticed the little details around her. Lately, something seemed off. Over the past week, Sarah had noticed police cars driving through her street more frequently than usual. The sight was strange in her serene neighborhood, where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. The officers weren't there for a friendly patrol either. They drove slowly, peering at houses like they were searching for something or someone. Sarah didn't think much of it at first. Maybe there was a new safety program in the area, or perhaps they were handling a small incident that would soon be forgotten. But deep down, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling it gave her. That Friday evening, Sarah returned home after a long day at the library. It had been a particularly busy day, with several schoolchildren visiting for a project. She was exhausted but content. Carrying a bag of groceries, she stepped into her house and locked the door behind her. The sun was setting, casting warm golden hues across her living room. Everything seemed perfectly normal. But the feeling of unease crept back. She glanced out of her window, noticing a police car parked at the corner of the street. It wasn't unusual for officers to stop for a break, but this one had been there for hours. Sarah shook her head, trying to dismiss her thoughts. Maybe she was imagining things. Later that night, as she curled up with a book and a cup of tea, Sarah noticed another odd detail. There was movement outside her house, footsteps on the sidewalk. She peered out through her curtains and saw a shadowy figure walking past. It didn't look like a jogger or a neighbor on an evening stroll. The figure paused near her driveway before disappearing into the darkness. Sarah's heart raced, but she told herself not to overthink. She decided to go to bed early, hoping to shake off the strange feeling that had been lingering all day. Just as she was drifting off to sleep, a loud, heavy knock shattered the silence. Sarah jumped out of bed, her heart pounding in her chest. The knocking grew louder, more forceful, as if the person at her door was determined to get in. "Police, open the door," a deep voice called out. Sarah froze, unsure of what to do. She hadn't done anything wrong. Why were the police at her door so late at night? Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her robe and cautiously approached the door. She peeked through the peephole, seeing the dark uniforms and stern faces of 3 officers. Something told her that whatever was about to happen would change her life forever. Sarah's heart raced as she stood frozen behind the door. The forceful knocking continued, each pound echoing through her quiet home. She tried to steady her breathing and convince herself that there had to be a reasonable explanation for this sudden visit. Still, fear gripped her tightly. "Police, open the door now." The voice boomed again, sharp and demanding. Sarah reached for her phone on the nearby table. Her hands trembled as she quickly dialed her neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, a kind elderly woman who lived across the street. But the call didn't go through. Her phone showed no signal. She stared at it, confused and uneasy. What was going on? The banging on the door grew louder. "Ma'am, this is your final warning," one of the officers shouted. Realizing she couldn't avoid the confrontation, Sarah hesitated but finally unlocked the door. As she slowly opened it, 3 officers stood on her porch. Their expressions were stern, almost accusing. The tallest one stepped forward. His badge gleamed under the porch light, and his voice was steady but cold. "Sarah Bennett?" he asked, though it was clear they already knew her name. "Yes, that's me," she replied cautiously. "What is this about?" The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he scanned her up and down, his gaze sharp and scrutinizing. "We received a tip that you're harboring a fugitive. We need to search your home," he said bluntly. Sarah blinked in disbelief. "A fugitive? In my house?" she repeated, her voice shaking. "That's impossible. I live alone. There's no one here but me." The officer's expression didn't change. "We have reliable information," he insisted. "Step aside, ma'am. This won't take long." "I don't understand," Sarah said, her voice growing firmer. "There must be some mistake. I don't even know who you're talking about." The officer sighed impatiently, glancing back at his colleagues. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way, ma'am. It's your choice." Sarah's fear began to mix with a flicker of anger. She wasn't a criminal, and she had done nothing wrong. "Do you have a warrant?" she asked, folding her arms in front of her chest. Her question seemed to catch the officer off guard. His jaw tightened, and he exchanged a quick glance with the others. "We don't need one right now." "This is an urgent matter," he said. "That doesn't sound right," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "I know my rights." Her defiance seemed to irritate them further. One of the other officers, a younger man with a sharp expression, stepped forward. "Ma'am, you're obstructing a police investigation. Step aside, or we'll have to take further action." Before Sarah could respond, the tallest officer pushed past her, stepping into the house. "This is your last chance to cooperate," he said over his shoulder. "Hey, you can't do that." Sarah protested, following after him. Her fear was quickly turning into outrage. "You have no right to barge into my home." The other two officers followed the first, ignoring her protests as they began searching her house. They opened drawers, looked under furniture, and rifled through her belongings. Sarah stood in the center of the room, helpless and horrified, as they invaded her private space. "Stop this. I told you there's no one here," she shouted, but her words fell on deaf ears. The scene felt surreal, like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Who had given them this tip, and why would anyone accuse her of hiding a fugitive? As the officers continued their search, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger and far more dangerous. Sarah stood in the middle of her living room, her mind racing as the officers rummaged through her home. They opened cupboards, pulled out drawers, and even overturned her sofa cushions. Her once cozy sanctuary now felt like a battlefield. She clenched her fists, trying to control the mix of fear and anger boiling inside her. "Please stop this," she pleaded, her voice louder this time. "I told you, there's no one here. You're making a mistake." One of the officers, the younger one with a sharp jawline, turned to her with a cold stare. "Stay back, Mom. Let us do our job," he said sternly, pointing a finger at her as if she were the criminal. Sarah couldn't believe what was happening. Her quiet life had never prepared her for something like this. She felt helpless, watching strangers rip apart her home, treating her like she was guilty of something she didn't even understand. "Where's your warrant?" she demanded again, summoning the courage to stand her ground. "You can't just come in here and destroy my home without one." The tall officer who seemed to be in charge sighed in frustration. "We're acting on a tip, ma'am. You're making this harder than it needs to be." "Harder?" Sarah shot back, her voice rising. "You've already broken into my home and turned it upside down. There's no fugitive here, and you know it." The tension in the room was thick. The officers exchanged glances, their patience clearly wearing thin. Finally, the tall officer stepped closer to Sarah, his tone more intimidating now. "Listen, Mom," he said through gritted teeth. "If you don't calm down, we'll have no choice but to take you in for obstruction." Sarah's heart pounded. Obstruction. She wasn't the one in the wrong here. "Take me in." "For what?" "For standing in my own home while you trash it," she exclaimed, her voice trembling but defiant. Before she could say another word, the younger officer stepped forward, grabbing her arm. "That's it. You're coming with us," he said, his grip firm. "Let go of me," Sarah cried, trying to pull away. The sudden physical force shocked her. She hadn't done anything wrong, and now they were treating her like a criminal. "You can't do this." The struggle caught the attention of her neighbor, Michael, who had been watching from his window across the street. He quickly grabbed his phone and started recording. The sight of Sarah being manhandled by the officers was enough to make his blood boil. He knew something wasn't right. Back inside the house, Sarah was overwhelmed. One officer grabbed her other arm, restraining her further, while the third continued searching the house as if nothing was happening. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She didn't want to show weakness. "This is wrong," she said, her voice cracking. "You're making a terrible mistake." The officers ignored her. As they dragged her toward the door, Sarah caught a glimpse of her neighbor standing on his porch, phone in hand. Relief and hope flickered in her chest. Someone was watching. Someone knew what was happening wasn't right. The officers loaded her into their car, slamming the door shut. Sarah sat in the back seat, her mind spinning. She didn't know where they were taking her, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about a mistaken identity or a bad tip. Something bigger was happening, and Sarah was caught right in the middle of it. As the police cars sped away, Sarah sat in the back seat, her hands trembling. The cold cuffs around her wrists felt like a nightmare come to life. She kept replaying the events over and over in her mind, trying to make sense of them. What had she done to deserve this? Who could have accused her of something so outrageous? The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't a random mistake. Someone had targeted her. Across the street, Michael lowered his phone, his heart racing. He had seen enough to know that something wasn't right. Sarah was a quiet woman, always polite and kind. She wasn't the type to be involved in criminal activities, let alone harboring a fugitive. He replayed the video he had recorded, the sound of Sarah's protests echoing through his phone. It made his stomach churn. Michael was no stranger to uncovering the truth. He had spent years as a reporter before retiring to this quiet neighborhood. His instincts told him there was more to the story, and he wasn't about to let it go. He uploaded the video to his private account, deciding to share it with a few trusted contacts in the media. Meanwhile, Sarah was taken to the police station. The officers didn't say much as they led her inside and sat her down in a small, cold room with a single table and chair. She tried to ask questions, but they ignored her. Minutes felt like hours as she waited, alone with her thoughts and rising anxiety. Back in the neighborhood, Michael was already taking action. He reached out to a journalist friend, Emma, who still worked in investigative reporting. "I've got something you need to see," he said over the phone, his voice urgent. He sent her the video, explaining what he had witnessed. Emma promised to look into it immediately. Michael also began digging into Sarah's background, trying to find any reason why someone might have targeted her. He pulled up local news articles and public records, but there was nothing unusual. No criminal history, no lawsuits, no controversial connections. Sarah was just a librarian living a quiet life. The more he uncovered, the more convinced he became that this was an abuse of power. At the police station, Sarah finally faced one of the officers, a stern-looking man with a clipboard. He began asking questions, but they were vague and confusing. "Do you know John Marshall?" he asked. "No," Sarah replied, shaking her head. "I don't know anyone by that name." The officer didn't seem satisfied. "We have reason to believe you're hiding him. Are you sure you don't want to come clean?" Sarah felt her frustration rise. "I've never heard of him," she said firmly. "Why don't you tell me who accused me of this?" But the officer didn't answer her question. Instead, he left the room, leaving Sarah alone again. She realized they weren't interested in listening to her. They had already made up their minds. Outside the station, Michael's video was gaining traction. Emma had shared it with a few other journalists, and people on social media were beginning to notice. Comments poured in, with many expressing outrage over what had happened. The pressure was starting to build. As Sarah sat in the cold, silent room, she had no idea that help was already on the way. Michael's actions were the first spark in what would soon become a wildfire, bringing her closer to the truth. and to justice. Sarah sat in the interrogation room, her mind racing with questions and fears. The room felt colder with every passing second. The walls were bare, and the silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional sounds of footsteps in the hallway. She stared at the empty chair across from her, wondering when someone would come in and give her answers, or at least let her speak. Finally, the door opened, and a new officer stepped in, carrying a file. He was older, with a no-nonsense demeanor. He placed the file on the table and sat down across from her, his sharp eyes studying her closely. "Miss Bennett," he began, "I'm Officer Grant. We've received a serious tip connecting you to John Marshall, a wanted fugitive. Now's your chance to explain." "I don't know him," Sarah said firmly, trying to keep her voice steady. "I've never even heard of him." Grant didn't react. Instead, he opened the file and pulled out a photo. "This is him," he said, sliding the picture across the table. Sarah glanced at it. The man in the photo had a rugged face with a thick beard and tired eyes. She shook her head. "I don't know him," she repeated. "Why would someone think I'm hiding him?" Grant leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "That's what we're trying to figure out," he said. "The tip we received was specific. Your name, your address. Someone claims you've been helping this man avoid capture." Sarah's stomach sank. Who would do this to her? Who would lie about something so serious? She tried to stay calm, but the panic was creeping in. "This is a mistake," she said. "Someone must be trying to frame me." Grant raised an eyebrow. "And why would someone frame you, Miss Bennett? Is there anyone who might want to cause you trouble?" Sarah paused, her mind racing. At first, she couldn't think of anyone. She lived a quiet life, avoided drama, and had no enemies, or so she thought. Then a name popped into her head, and her chest tightened. Her ex-husband, Mark. Could he be behind this? He had always been controlling and manipulative during their marriage. Even after the divorce, he had made it clear that he held a grudge. But framing her for harboring a fugitive, that seemed extreme, even for him. "I don't know for sure," Sarah said carefully, not wanting to make accusations without proof. "But I do have an ex-husband who might hold something against me. He's not exactly a trustworthy person." Grant didn't respond immediately, but she could see him making a mental note. "Interesting," he said after a pause. "We'll look into that. For now, you'll remain in custody while we verify your claims." "In custody?" Sarah asked, her voice rising. "I haven't done anything wrong. You can't just keep me here based on someone else's lies." "Calm down, Ms. Bennett," Grant said coolly. "We're doing our job." Before Sarah could argue further, he stood up and left the room, leaving her alone once again. Her frustration boiled over. She felt like a pawn in someone else's cruel game, and no one seemed interested in hearing her side of the story. Meanwhile, outside the station, the video Michael had posted was spreading fast. Social media was buzzing with outrage, with people demanding an explanation for Sarah's arrest. Journalists began digging into her background, uncovering the truth about her peaceful life, and raising questions about the police's actions. As Sarah sat in that cold, silent room, she had no idea that the world was starting to take notice, and that the truth was slowly coming to light. As Sarah sat in the small interrogation room, the world outside was quickly changing. The video Michael had shared was now all over social media. People were furious. They watched, listened, and shared the video, discussing the strange and unjust events that had unfolded at Sarah's home. Some questioned the actions of the police. Others supported Sarah, demanding answers. Hashtags like #FreeSarah and #JusticeForSarah began trending. News outlets quickly picked up the story, with reporters asking why the police had acted so aggressively without clear evidence. Sarah had become a symbol of the fight against injustice. Inside the police station, things were moving faster than Sarah could have imagined. The phone calls, emails, the requests for information, they were all pouring in. The police officers who had been part of her arrest could no longer ignore the pressure building from the outside world. Back at her house, her neighbor Michael continued to follow the story closely. His phone rang constantly with calls from journalists and news outlets eager to know more. Emma, the journalist he had contacted earlier, had already written an article that was gaining popularity. She was digging into the police department's history, looking for any signs of corruption or wrongdoing. Michael was beginning to see how much attention this case was getting. It was no longer just about Sarah. It was about something bigger. The police force's behavior was now being questioned, and the people wanted answers. Michael, although retired, felt a growing sense of responsibility to help expose the truth. He was no longer just a neighbor. He was a key part of bringing the story to light. At the police station, Officer Grant was feeling the heat. The station had received calls from the media, demanding an explanation for the arrest. He paced back and forth in his office, his mind racing. The last thing he had expected was for Sarah's case to gain so much attention. The pressure was on, and now he had to decide how to handle the situation. Sarah, still sitting in the interrogation room, could hear the noise in the hallways. She had been waiting for hours, unsure of what was happening outside. All she wanted was to go home, to have her name cleared, and to put this nightmare behind her. But it seemed like everything was spiraling out of her control. Just then, Officer Grant entered the room again. His expression was tense, and for the first time, Sarah noticed a slight crack in his usual composure. He didn't sit down, but instead stood in front of her, clearly trying to figure out how to handle the situation. "Ms. Bennett," he said, his voice quieter than before, "we've received a lot of calls. The public is questioning our actions. The video that was posted online is spreading fast." Sarah felt a surge of hope. People were speaking out. The truth was starting to get through. "So you're going to let me go?" she asked, almost unable to believe it. Grant hesitated before responding. "Not yet," he said, "but we're reviewing everything. Your ex-husband has been mentioned, and we're going to look into his involvement. If he's behind this, we'll have to take that into account." Sarah's mind raced. Mark, her ex-husband, was always quick to cause trouble. He had always been vengeful, especially after their divorce. But this, framing her for something this serious, it seemed impossible. Yet the pieces were starting to fall into place. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow connected to it all. As the hours passed, more and more people began to speak out in Sarah's defense. Local activists, neighbors, and even strangers who had watched the video were all demanding justice. Sarah had become the face of a growing movement, one that stood for fairness and accountability. Outside, the world was watching, and Sarah finally realized that the truth was starting to shine through. The public was on her side, and it wasn't long before the police would have no choice but to listen. The days after Sarah's arrest felt like a blur. She was still in police custody, but everything around her was changing. The video of her being treated unfairly by the officers had gone viral, and the public outcry was growing stronger by the hour. People all over the country were demanding answers. The police couldn't ignore the pressure any longer. Inside the police station, Officer Grant's frustration was growing. What had started as a simple tip had now become a full-blown scandal. Reporters, activists, and even local politicians were calling for answers. The department had promised to investigate, but the truth was, they were scrambling to cover up their mistakes. The evidence they had wasn't solid. The tip they'd received about Sarah harboring a fugitive was vague at best, and the officers involved had no real proof. Meanwhile, Michael, Sarah's neighbor, was not resting. He had been in touch with Emma, the journalist he had reached out to earlier. Together, they had uncovered something unsettling. They discovered that the police officers involved in Sarah's arrest had a history of questionable behavior. Officer Grant, the one who had interrogated Sarah, had been part of previous incidents where police overreach was suspected. This wasn't the first time they had acted without proper evidence. The more Michael and Emma dug, the clearer it became that this was not just about a false tip. There was something bigger at play, something that connected Sarah to the officer's behavior. Michael was convinced that Sarah was being targeted for a reason. But what was it? Back at the police station, Grant was beginning to feel the weight of the situation. The internal investigation was underway, but the pressure from the outside world was relentless. He couldn't stop thinking about the accusations Sarah had made about her ex-husband, Mark. He had brushed it off at first, but now it seemed worth investigating. Grant didn't know how involved Mark was, but he couldn't ignore the possibility that Sarah's ex-husband might be connected to this whole mess. Grant had his team look into Mark Bennett. They dug into his past and found some disturbing information. Mark had a criminal record, a history of violent behavior, and connections to unsavory individuals. It was beginning to look like Sarah's hunch was right. Mark had a grudge against her, and he had the means to cause trouble. But did he have enough influence to set this entire thing in motion? As the investigation continued, Sarah was left in limbo, waiting for the truth to come to light. She hadn't heard much from her lawyer, but she knew they were working hard to get her out. Meanwhile, the pressure from the media was relentless. People were starting to ask hard questions about the police's role in her arrest, and they weren't letting up. Sarah could feel the walls closing in on the officers who had wronged her. The more the public demanded answers, the more she realized just how much power they had. Inside the police station, Grant was finally beginning to connect the dots. He wasn't sure what had happened yet, but it was clear now that this wasn't just a mistake. Something had gone wrong, and it wasn't just Sarah who had been hurt. If Mark Bennett was behind this, it could mean serious trouble for everyone involved. The investigation was far from over, but one thing was clear: the truth was slowly unraveling, and it wasn't going to be easy for anyone to ignore it. Days passed, and the tension surrounding Sarah's case continued to build. The media coverage was nonstop, and the public was demanding answers. The investigation into the officer's actions was moving forward, but no one had fully connected all the dots yet. Sarah remained in custody, her fate hanging in the balance. One afternoon, as Sarah sat quietly in her cell, a new development came through. Officer Grant entered the holding area with a stack of papers in his hand. His expression was serious, but something in his eyes seemed different. He wasn't angry, but he wasn't quite relaxed either. "Ms. Bennett," he said, looking at her with a trace of hesitation, "we've discovered something that might change things." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Could this finally be the moment she was waiting for? "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of hope and fear. Grant set the papers down on the small table in the room. "We've been looking into your ex-husband, Mark. It seems he's been involved in some questionable activities for quite a while. We found evidence that he may have played a part in the tip we received about you." Sarah's mind raced. She had suspected Mark's involvement from the beginning, but hearing the confirmation from an officer felt surreal. "Mark," she whispered. "But why? What would he gain from doing this?" Grant paused, and his eyes softened just a little. "We believe he's been using his connections to get back at you. After your divorce, he seemed to have a deep resentment towards you. It appears he might have orchestrated this entire situation to ruin your life." The realization hit Sarah hard. Mark had always been controlling, angry, and spiteful. She had hoped that once she was free of him, he would leave her alone, but she was wrong. He had never stopped trying to make her pay for leaving him, and now it seemed like he had gone too far. "Are you saying he's behind this whole thing?" Sarah asked, still struggling to believe it. Grant nodded. "We're still gathering all the details, but it looks like he used his connections to make sure you were falsely accused. He's been in touch with some people who have ties to the local law enforcement, and it seems he used that influence to plant the false tip that led to your arrest." Sarah felt a rush of emotions: anger, betrayal, but also a sense of relief. She had known something was wrong, but hearing that Mark had been the mastermind behind it all made her stomach turn. How could someone she had once loved do something so cruel? "I'm sorry this happened to you, Ms. Bennett," Grant said. "We've already begun questioning Mark. He doesn't seem to have expected this much attention, and we're working to piece everything together." Sarah stood up, her hands still trembling but her voice steady. "What happens now? Will you let me go?" Grant nodded. "Yes. Based on what we've uncovered, you're free to go. We'll make sure to clear your name completely. The charges will be dropped, and we'll make sure the officers involved are held accountable." Sarah's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. She wasn't completely free yet. There was still the matter of clearing her name in the eyes of the public and dealing with the emotional fallout from everything she had been through. But this was a turning point. She knew the truth was coming to light, and Mark's grip on her life was finally beginning to loosen. As Sarah was led out of the police station, she took a deep breath. For the first time in days, she felt the weight on her shoulders begin to lift. But she knew this wasn't the end. The fight for justice was far from over, and she would be ready to face whatever came next. Sarah stepped out of the police station, her heart pounding in her chest. The air felt different now, fresher, lighter, but the weight of everything she had endured still hung on her shoulders. She was free, but the battle wasn't over. The truth had come out, but there was still work to be done. She knew this wasn't just about her. It was about standing up for what was right and making sure nothing like this happened to anyone else. Her lawyer, who had been working tirelessly on her case, was waiting for her outside. "Sarah, we did it," he said with a smile, but she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. "The charges are officially dropped. You're a free woman now." For the first time in days, Sarah allowed herself to feel a flicker of relief. She smiled back, though her thoughts were still swirling. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. She knew she couldn't have made it through without her lawyer's help and the support of her friends. But her journey wasn't over yet. Mark, her ex-husband, hadn't disappeared from the picture. The police were still investigating his connections, and it was clear that he had played a major role in the conspiracy to frame her. She couldn't let him go unpunished. Sarah needed to see justice served, not just for herself, but for anyone who might be harmed by people like Mark in the future. Meanwhile, Michael, her neighbor, was still active in spreading the truth. His video had sparked a movement, and people were rallying for justice. He was in touch with journalists, activists, and anyone who could help shine a spotlight on the corruption that had nearly destroyed Sarah's life. Emma, the reporter who had helped uncover the police officer's past, was writing a follow-up story, now focusing on the lengths Mark had gone to in order to exact revenge on Sarah. Sarah knew the road ahead would be long. The public outcry wasn't just about her. It was about the system that allowed things like this to happen in the first place. People were demanding accountability, not just for the officers involved, but for the broken systems that had allowed Sarah to be falsely accused in the first place. A few days later, Sarah met with the police department again. This time, it was different. Officer Grant was there too, but his posture was less confident, almost apologetic. He had come to understand just how wrong things had gone. He looked at Sarah and said, "I want to personally apologize for the way you were treated. I know it doesn't make up for what happened, but we're doing everything we can to make things right." Sarah nodded, feeling the sincerity in his words. "I appreciate that," she said, "but this isn't just about what happened to me. It's about ensuring this never happens again." Officer Grant agreed. "We're starting reforms," he said. "The officers involved will be held accountable, and we're reviewing our procedures to make sure this doesn't happen again." It wasn't enough to heal all the wounds, but it was a step in the right direction. Sarah returned to her quiet life, but she wasn't the same person anymore. The ordeal had changed her. She had found a new strength within herself, one she never knew existed. She began speaking out, not just for herself, but for others who had been wronged. Her story had become a symbol of resilience, of standing up in the face of injustice, no matter how hard it seemed. As Sarah looked out at the world around her, she knew one thing for sure: justice had been served. And with the truth finally coming to light, she was ready to embrace her future, whatever it might hold. This final part brings closure to the story while leaving us see